it's true. You kind of get your sleep, you get your vacation in the summertime when it's quiet, and then everybody
Good morning.
is on deck from there on out.
This morning is the third in the series. And the notes, which are sitting on the pedestal at the back of the room, remain the same for all 5 lectures. This morning, I will be picking up right around Romans 4 of the notes, and I'll start with a quick recap of where I think we are. We've been tracing very briefly some of the ideas. Incidentally, someone made the remark to me earlier that I speak awfully quickly and that it's very hard to take notes. And frankly, that's why I've given you notes, because I am trying to compress what is probably the better part of a semester of early Christian history in 5 45-minute sessions. And so I really have to move pretty quickly or we just won't get through this stuff. So we were tracing very briefly some of the ideas that were proposed by the earliest followers of Jesus, some of whom were unwilling to give up their attachment to Second Temple Judaism, while others, many of whom we will talk about this morning, were Hellenist or Greek converts, and they had never become attached to Judaism and really didn't fully understand it. We have testimony to this not being a very happy situation in the Acts of the Apostles, where Peter is approached and is told that the widows and orphans in the Jerusalem community, who were Hellenist as opposed to Jewish or Judaic, were not getting food and medical care and assistance as part of the community itself. And so here we have evidence in the Acts of the Apostles, probably written in the end of the 1st century, that there was already discrimination among the leadership of the church between those who were Jews and Christians and those who were Greeks and Christians. The Jews had encountered Hellenist philosophy for several hundred years before the time of Christ. And in fact, the last books of the Hebrew Bible, the so-called wisdom literature, were originally written in Greek and incorporated in the Hebrew Bible during those 200 years before the time of Christ. And I would have to say that the philosophy which is expressed in those books is not exactly consistent with a lot of the philosophy that you find in the Torah, which tends to be very, very nationalist and very people-specific, i.e. the chosen people, as opposed to the wisdom literature, which seems to be more universal and talks about the universal philosophy and brotherhood of humankind. The life of Christ itself, as described in the 4 Gospels, was ambiguous as to whether Jesus was intending to found a new church or whether he was intending to reform really corrupt Second Temple Judaism. That issue has been debated for 2,000 years. And in fact, there was a very, very interesting exchange only a few years ago between the chief rabbi of Jerusalem and Pope Benedict over this issue. And they each published a book, and they each talked about the ideas that the other had. And it seems to me that the chief rabbi got the better of the argument, and that Benedict, in a subsequent speech, actually acknowledged the debt of Christianity to Judaism and suggested that maybe the Christians had gone beyond where they had to go in that 1st century. So today we're going to turn to Paul. Paul is, of course, the seminal figure in the creation of Christianity. The first time that I taught a course on the history of Judeo-Christianity in the first century at Florida Gulf Coast University, they very carefully added a little quote down below the title of the course, and it was, "Did Paul invent Christianity?" Just to add a little bit of controversy to the course. Okay, first of all, we have to recognize that the church is, of course, made of people. And therefore, the ideas of people are necessarily formed by the kinds of lives they lived, kinds of societies they lived in, the moral codes they believed. Christians, of course, we believe that the Holy Spirit inspires, and that the ideas of these individuals are, for the most part, inspired ideas. But history tells us very clearly that some of those ideas were not only controversial, they were inconsistent, and some of them were just plain wrong. And that's where we're going to be turning in the next couple of weeks. One major question, which has been debated by church theologians and others, philosophers, forever, is this: how do you know that the Spirit is present when someone makes a significant statement about the future of humankind or of a given society? What is the inspired Word of God? How do we recognize it? I'm not going to answer that question this morning. Those of you who are very anxious to hear the answer can turn to the very last page of the notes and you can jump ahead, because I'm hoping that we'll talk a little bit about that in the last class. Paul's letters, of course, when they are ordered in the likely order in which he wrote them, and I suspect that most of you are aware of the fact that the order of Paul's letters in the New Testament does not reflect the order in which he wrote them. The letter to the Romans is first because it was the longest. And as I mentioned to you last week, most written materials at that time appeared in 16-page folios, which were then attached together. And therefore, when you were copying over the material that someone else had written, you started with the longest piece first. That is probably, incidentally, why Matthew's gospel appears before Mark's gospel in the New Testament, because Matthew's gospel is almost twice as long as Mark's. And the letter to the Romans, is by far the largest and longest letter of Paul. And in fact, it was quite likely the last letter he wrote, and probably summarized the end of his thinking, the end of the growth of his thinking about theology. Let me give you a couple quick statements about what I think we can take away from Paul. First of all, Paul is described by most as the most intensely practical theologian that the church has ever known. And by that we mean a couple of things. We learn, first of all, that he describes to us in several of his letters that he had a very difficult life, that he was often shipwrecked, he was quite ill. Many have suggested that he had been infected with malaria in Tarsus, a disease which we now know was prevalent in Tarsus at the time that he was there as a young boy. And he may have had bouts of malaria throughout his life. But he had other issues as well. And so he wasn't a very healthy or well man, and he frequently complained. My Jewish friends describe him as being the ultimate kvetcher in the New Testament, because there are so many places in his letters where he complains about the things that have happened to him, and yet he triumphed each time, he says. So we conclude from that, I conclude from that that in his case, his theology is built on illness and personal tragedy. Paul was intimately familiar with the notion of suffering and was unwilling to jump to the resurrection. He had to go through the crucifixion to get to the resurrection. I think that is a bedrock foundational issue that comes loud and clear from Paul's letters. His letters also suggest to us that there was a certain level of turmoil among Christians at the time. He condemns specifically two levels of people. One he refers to as Judaizers, and we believe these were probably the members of the community who taught that you needed to be a good Jew before you could be a good Christian, something with which Paul did not agree, as we know. And then there were so-called Spiritists, and the Spiritists were apparently a group of people who spoke in tongues and appeared in his congregations and proclaimed themselves to be prophets as a result of their ability to speak in tongues. And of course, Paul has an entire letter where he describes all of the talents of all of the members of his communities, and he basically puts those who can speak in tongues in their place, so to speak, among all of the other talents that his people had. Another idea is that Paul deeply believed in the Greek theology, the Greek philosophy of dualism, that each of us has a body and a soul, or a spirit, or as we will later hear, spark, and that the body and the spirit are often not in the same place, and that one is urging in one direction and the other in another. It's pretty obvious, however, that Paul knew Greek philosophy, and we know, thanks to his own letters, his own words, and also the description of his early life in the Acts of the Apostles, that Paul probably spent the first 15 or 16 years of his life in the Greek city of Tarsus, which is actually in Turkey, but at that time that was a Hellenist city. Tarsus was considered to be one of the three leading centers of Greek philosophy at the time. And Paul did attend the gymnasium in Tarsus, probably until the age of about 14 or 15, when many historians now suggest that his parents became convinced that he was becoming too Greek. And as a consequence, they sent him to Jerusalem, presumably at first to live with a relative. There's some suggestion that he had an older sister who had married and was living in Jerusalem, and that may have been where he went, but no one can really prove that. But he ultimately joined the cohort of a rabbi and spent the next 4 to 6 years studying the Torah with this rabbi. Some historians have even named the rabbi that he studied with as being Gamaliel I. There is also a Gamaliel II, who's a very key figure in the New Testament. But they say Gamaliel I was Paul's teacher. And as a consequence, by the time he was a young man, Paul was a very confused young guy. He had been raised in one tradition and then had been yanked out of that tradition and taken into another. And Paul tells us that he was very, very ardent in his following of all of this stuff, that he was a great student at the gymnasium, and he was a greater student in the Torah. He tells us, in fact, that he was first in his class in the Torah, and he describes his ancestry as being ancient and of the principal tribe, Benjamin, of the ancient Jews. Paul became a Pharisee just prior to the time that Jesus began his public ministry. And as a consequence, he would have been horrified by many of the things that Jesus was preaching. because the Pharisees at the time had concluded that the New Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem we heard about in the Revelation to John this morning, our second reading, would only come about when the Jews themselves had developed their societies to such a point where there was no suffering, there was no poor, there was no hunger within their city, and then the New Jerusalem would be proclaimed. Prior to that, there had been a lot of prophetic notion that the New Jerusalem would come about through the coming of God, Yahweh, and that Yahweh would bring the New Jerusalem and basically bestow it on his people. By the time of Christ, the Pharisees had developed the philosophy of self-help, so to speak, that the Jews had to bring about a good society to lay the field work for Yahweh to come. And so Yahweh was not going to bring the New Jerusalem. The people of Israel were going to create the New Jerusalem, and then Yahweh would come to preside over it. And you can see that's a very, very fundamental difference. There are several ideas that are developed in Paul's letters which really fit the description of this course, which is the difference between orthodoxy and heresy. Let me go into a few of those. The first is the role of authority versus congregationalism. Let me explain very briefly. Of course, the role of authority, the model, an authoritarian model would have a king or an emperor, or in the case of later Roman Catholicism, a pope, at the head of a pyramid, and that below that pyramid there would be successive layers of authority, and that all doctrine would be decided at the top and pushed down. All determination of liturgy would be decided at the top and pushed down. This was really the notion that was prevalent at the time within the Roman Empire. We all know that there was an enormous transition from the Greek city-state politics to the Roman Empire. The first was more or less democratic, whereas by the time the Caesars began to take greater and greater control in Rome, the Roman Empire became top-down and authoritarian. All of the churches that Paul created were house churches, and each of those house churches was set up as a unit. He described them as being in union with each other, but he did not insist that they all be the same. And each one of those house churches typically had a leader. The leader was at first and often the largest Christian landowner in town, because that he or she would have the largest facility to host a liturgy, first on Saturday and then on Sunday. And then later, after the time of Paul, those house churches began to form into dioceses and began to elect their bishops. This obviously was a very, very different model from the model that began to come into place in the middle of the second century within Christianity, when we had 5 patriarchies, the 5 great cities of Christianity: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And then below the leaders or bishops of those communities, there were local bishops. The local bishops were, at that time, typically elected by the presbyters and leaders of the communities in the house churches, and then approved by the bishops around. And so we see, if we read Paul's letters carefully, that Paul's church was a very democratic church, and it was a very diverse church. And the Christian leaders of the late 2nd century rejected that model of church. And we see that it was completely submerged within the imperial and then feudal Roman Catholicism, and it wasn't really back on the scene until the Protestant Reformation, when all of these issues began to bubble to the surface again. The role of the people in determining their Christian faith. The second idea that Paul talked about, of course, which is again one that he developed at that time, and then it was submerged, and then it was redeveloped during the Protestant Reformation, and that is, how can you be saved? And of course, Paul's answer was simple. You can't save yourself, but you can be saved by saying yes to the freely given grace of God. That, of course, in Paul's time, was a great distinction from the prevailing notion of the Jews and the Pharisees. And that is that the way to be saved is to be righteous. And to be righteous means that you must follow all of the rules of the Torah to the maximum extent possible at every point and every time in your life. You can see how later in history, or maybe I hope you can see, how these notions morphed. And by the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Christian church, the Roman church, had basically moved back toward the Torah, had created scholarly books, there were scholastic books they were called, listing literally hundreds and hundreds of sins and the penance that you should do if you committed one of those sins, and the notion that if you died with those sins on your soul, you would go to hell. And then they took the ultimate step and started selling indulgences, and that you could take care of some of these sins by doing certain things like giving money to your church or donating something to the church cemetery or something like that. And so we see this essential original notion of Paul of a freely given grace salvation versus a rule-based salvation where the individual earns salvation by doing something. He broke, therefore, with the Jews over that issue, big time. And then it was sort of sublimated over the next several years, several centuries, and ultimately, by the time of the Reformation, had been totally corrupted. And the church had essentially dropped completely back into the Torah notions of earning salvation by doing things. That was the second really, really critical issue that was brought about by Paul, which was lost by the church and then came back into the church, incidentally, first by the Protestants in the Reformation, and then about 250 to 300 years later, the Roman church finally admitted it was wrong too and went back the same way. And then the final issue that Paul was involved in was the question of Judaic sacrifice. How important was it that there be an elevated priesthood, a high priest, who alone with his acolytes could offer sacrifice to God? Paul, of course, broke with that notion. Of course, it was made a little bit easier a few years later. His notions were made because about 4 or 5 years after his death, the Second Temple was destroyed and the last high priest took office. To give you an idea of what was going on during the time of Paul, however, the Roman histories of the time report that in the roughly 35 years between 35 and 70, roughly the date of the crucifixion to the destruction of the temple, there were 32 high priests. And so the high priest was being replaced almost every year, and it was being given to the highest bidder. And so the Judaic concept of sacrifice was really quite and totally corrupt. And Paul knew this, of course, since he was quite aware of all these issues. There's a very interesting book, and incidentally, some of you have asked me if I have a bibliography, and I did prepare one this week. I will get it to Nicholas during this week, and we'll have it next Sunday. But one of the books on the bibliography is called The Two Pauls, and it's written by two of the probably most famous and irreverent Christian authors of our time, John Crossan and Marcus Borg. And they very clearly, in this very short 150-page book, trace how Paul was probably seen during his lifetime, how he was demoted in the 2nd century, and then resurrected at the time of the Protestant Reformation. And so they describe the first Paul, the second Paul, and then they say the Reformation Paul is the first Paul reincarnated. It's quite obvious that Paul was seminal in the development of Christianity. Probably the most important issue, it was one I referred to a couple of weeks ago, and that is the notion of whether or not you had to be a Jew to become a Christian. And of course, Paul successfully argued at the Jerusalem Council in, we think, about 56, that you didn't have to be a Jew to be a Christian. That had an incredible impact on Christianity. Until that time, virtually all Christians were Jews or Jewish converts. And after that time, Greeks flooded into the church, and within a generation, they were in a clear majority. And so the church radically changed. Christianity radically changed in the generation or two after the time of Paul. I'm going to turn to another figure now, an early figure, who was actually almost a contemporary of both Jesus and Paul. And I guess it's pretty obvious to you that Jesus and Paul were probably contemporaries. They were probably both born right around 3 to 6 BC. Of course, Jesus was crucified around somewhere between 31 and 35, whereas Paul was martyred most likely in about 67 or 68. Although there are historians who argue that Paul was not martyred in 67, that he went on and preached in Spain and died in Spain some 5 or 6 years later. We have not yet found any evidence in Spain that that was the case, but the historians will argue it nevertheless. But so there was another figure at this period who is noted by the theologians, and his name was Philo of Alexandria. That's Philo. He was probably born about 20 years before the time of Christ, but he lived beyond the death of Jesus, and so he was a contemporary. He was a philosopher, a Jew, and he apparently had become an enormous scholar in Judaic literature. He became a Christian in his 50s, and much of his writing dates after that. And essentially, he was the first to take up the question as to what role Jewish or Judaic literature had for Christians. He wrote extensively. There are 8 volumes about this big each of his material, very dense. And we have a scholar here in Naples who did his PhD dissertation on Philo. And he's a credit to all of us. He got his PhD at the age of 74. At that time, he was the oldest person who had received a PhD from Notre Dame. And he has written extensively on Philo. I've heard him speak here in Naples. He's quite an interesting character. Philo essentially did 2 things. He emphasized the similarity between the ethical systems that were preached by Jesus and the moral ethics that are described in the Torah. And he basically identified whole streams of moral theology. And I think he was probably the first Christian theologian to identify the importance of the development of moral theology in Christianity on the foundation of Jewish law. Quite obviously, the 10 Commandments. But more than that, well beyond that. He was a Stoic, and that's a name given to a certain kind of Greek philosopher who believes that the way you solve the dispute between body and soul, or body and spirit, is to deny your body, and that frees the spirit. And that's one of the essential elements of Stoicism. He was a Stoic, and he therefore developed, using his Stoic foundation, reading Jewish literature, he developed the notion that human beings could only come into a real relationship with their God by denying their bodies. And he was probably one of the very first theologians who talked about self-denial, sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and other ways of denying self in order to free the soul. A notion which has been carried forward through 2 millennia of Christian thinking. He's generally considered to be an acceptable theologian. And perhaps one of the most significant things that came from his writing is the idea that the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was the Word of God, and it belonged alongside the Gospels in the Christian Bible. That didn't happen for 300 years, but he is credited, and he and his followers are credited with establishing the notion that the Hebrew Bible was indeed the Word of God. And he did that essentially by arguing that the Hebrew Bible was almost entirely allegory, and that there's very little history. And therefore, it's possible to read so much of the Hebrew Bible. The other notion that is one that I thought of this morning when we heard the first reading from Isaiah, Christians very quickly began to look to the Hebrew Bible for prophetic works demonstrating that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. And the reading this morning from Isaiah is one of those. And Philo was the first to essentially comb through the Jewish prophets and begin to develop the notion that many of these prophetic words were suggestive of the coming of Jesus. That notion, incidentally, is being reconsidered quite seriously by theologians today. As I mentioned to you previously, the notion that the prophets were indeed seers or foreseers of the future is being debunked, and they're being called seers of the times or readers of the times as opposed to fortune tellers. But early Christians, and in fact bedrock fundamental Christianity today, will read every prophetic work as suggesting that the person being described as the Savior of Israel was in fact Jesus of Nazareth. And they will demonstrate to you how every word in the prophets leads to that conclusion. Perhaps the largest group of Christians outside of the what I would describe as the mainstream Christian mentality of the great cities of Christianity in the first century were the Gnostics. The Gnostics are a major theme in Christianity. And I'm going to try to do this in 10 minutes, which is... Gnosticism is basically a belief system. The word Gnostic, incidentally, means to know in Greek. And it is essentially the notion that the way to salvation is to place yourself in a position, either through self-sacrifice or education or joining with others, so that you can come in touch with the secrets that are unspoken in the Gospels. The secrets, incidentally, you will remember if you've read I'm sure you've read the Gospels. When you read the Gospels, you will see that Jesus frequently will preach, and his lessons will be recorded, parabolic or whatever. And then he will go off in secret with the disciples to teach them additional things. Okay. The Gnostics have picked up on that notion and have concluded that Jesus actually conveyed some secrets to the disciples that were not reflected in the Gospels. And that only by being in this privileged group of people to whom that notion, those notions, those ideas can be conveyed, can you be saved. Gnosticism was by far the second largest group of Christians until well after the Council of Nicaea, for hundreds of years. And there are still cells of Gnosticism in the Middle East. It came into the headlines a few years ago, more than a few now. In the 1950s, I believe it was 1954, an urn, a sealed urn, was found in the Nile Delta, in a place which has been described as Nag Hammadi. And this urn contained fragments of 21 documents that purported to be Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament. And several professors essentially made their name by arguing the conspiracy theories that somehow the Christians had deliberately left these books out, which are referred to as Gnostic books, although they may not have been the books of the Gnostics. And so there were a flurry of maybe 100 books written about those materials. We actually here at Trinity, I believe it was just before COVID, so it would have been about 4 or 5 years ago, hosted Elaine Pagels, a professor at Princeton Theological. And she was one of the 2 principal theologians who focused on the Gnostic Gospels. Let me talk a little bit about some of the concepts of the Gnostics that were then ultimately, in the Council of Nicaea, rejected as unchristian. Gnostics believe that each of us has a spark of the divine inside of us. Not so controversial. I mean, you could describe it as soul or spirit or spark. It's just a word. So that wasn't really so much. They adopted the Hellenist dualism that I talked about before, the notion that there was a spirit and a body. Again, not terribly controversial. But then comes the key. The secret key to releasing the spark, which can then join with all the other sparks of humanity in the Godhead, is through self-sacrifice and education at the hands of other older Gnostics. So redemption for Gnostics is not for everyone. It's only for those who choose to learn the secret keys from others. They talked about the apostolic instruction in secret that I described a moment ago. But perhaps the two most controversial issues that they talked about were that Jesus was only divine, that he was not a man, and that as God, he had the ability to appear in all sense as a human being before other human beings. But he was never born. He was never a man. He was like a play actor on the stage of humankind. That was a heresy that was actually formally declared to be heretical about 200 years later. It's even given a name, it's so important. It's called Docetism. There are some suggestions in the Gospel of John that that was true. And it's not unusual for some to describe the Gospel of John as a Gnostic gospel, although there are just as many who argue that it is not. We can talk later about what it means if Jesus was not man, what that means for us. It means basically, I think, that his suffering was useless. Was meaningless. It never happened. Because as God, he couldn't suffer. It also suggests that he never really was able to understand us as we try to understand him, because he, again, was never human. It's really a very, very important concept, which the Gnostics were condemned for. And now it's 11 o'clock, but I have one more really key issue I've got to get. Okay. Some of you have been, I'm sure, exposed to the notion that there are two gods. That there's the Jewish God, Yahweh, and there's the Christian God, the Father, Creator God. And that somehow the Jewish God is a lesser God than the Christian God. I can remember in parochial school that I was told something very similar to that, although not in quite those words. That is a basic Gnostic concept. And it was their attempt to explain the existence of evil in the world. The world was created by the Jewish God, the lesser God, and he made mistakes. And that's where evil comes from. And the God of Jesus, the Christian God, can't make mistakes and is trying to repair the damage done by this other God. Now, this is a heresy. It is not something that we accept. But it was very interesting to me that as early as the 1st century, some people who considered themselves to be Christians were attempting to answer the question of how an all-loving and an all-good God could permit evil to exist in the world. I cannot take that any farther this morning. We've got to get ready for the next service, but we'll pick it up again next week because it's a very, very important concept, obviously. Thank you.